colonial anthropology always stated that Indian labor or South Asian labor was much more easy to control and also hardworking, and labor didn't cost much in India, so it is a good replacement for African labor. So in mid 1830s, in the Gladstone plantations, the first Indian immigrants went, but this was not a full-fledged scheme, and there were also reports of Indians moving to these various colonies before, but when this Gladstone experiment was seen that it's working properly, in 1837 there was the passing of the Act 5, by which that was the first attempt at legalizing a process of indentureship. This was again extended in towards the end of that year by the Act 39. Then, but this time, so this only applied only in Calcutta, and later Bombay and Madras joined in, telling that they want an extension of the Act. That was in 1839, with which you have the first some kind of overseeing infrastructure that was coming in. But from the moment when these acts were coming in, the various abolitionist lobbies, especially the British and foreign anti-slavery society, they were collecting documents of atrocities against Indians, and then there was huge public outcry and it was stopped. I mean, the reasons on which it was stopped was mostly the various kinds of atrocities that were happening on them, and there was a huge mortality of Indian laborers, especially in Mauritius, because that was the place where most of the Indians were going. And so there was a complete ban on Indian immigration. It was mentioned that no British subject from India can be taken overseas. Now in 1844, when the thing again started, there was a much more elaborate regime. There were medical inspectors, and there was a quite elaborate system of checks on what kind of labor is coming, and it served various purposes. There was obviously the welfare thing there, but also the institution of medicine also created a check to kind of find out the proper immigrant body, the proper coolie body. So, and the place where this was happening most intensely was the ship space. So this would be this is a schematic diagram of a mid 19th century immigrant ship, Indian immigrant ship. Generally, okay. So in certain ways it's like any other steamship of that era, but there are significant divergences from the model of steamship of that time. One is that you have the easier if I come here. So there you have the mast, and in front of the mast you have two ventilators. These are cowl-headed ventilators, and cowl-headed ventilators you needed for grain ships, and also a lot of these grain ships were changed into Indian for carrying coolie immigrants. But then the number of ventilators increased tremendously. You have two ventilators there, then you have a ventilator here, you have a Thier's automatic pump here which kind of takes out the air out, and all this was happening because there was this very different conception of how disease got transmitted. That was the miasmatic theory of disease. The theory stated, I mean, this was before the germ theory of disease emerged. The germ theory assumes that you have a certain kind of vector, that you need a vector for the transmission of a disease. But the miasmatic theory it stresses that disease emerges out of miasma. Miasma is, I mean, what emerges out of a certain environment. So it is very much connected with a certain, so they had this idea of a topography of a disease. And one of the reasons that this was happening, that the ship space became a de facto quarantine space, was also that so the scheme worked in this way, that there are agents in India who took the laborers and they acted as agents, and ultimately the entire payment depended on how many of those who were transported got accepted as laborers in the plantation colonies in West Indies or Mauritius or Fiji. Now if they are not they are not in proper health and stuff, then they won't be paid. They will be returned, and then that will be at the cost of the agents. So this was one of the checks, that you don't send feeble-bodied coolies and that kind of thing. Now, so for instance, when you have a situation of epidemic, a huge debate ran in mid-19th century policy circles that what to do if there is a case of, for instance, like cholera, the most dreaded disease of mid-19th century South Asia. Then what to do? To stop immigration, or so then it was the policy that was stated was that if there is a case of cholera, the best thing to do is that you hasten transportation. You hasten transportation, put all the people on the ships, and the gestation period that you will find from the port to the port, within that time the disease will go away, which means the patient will die, or there is a certain kind of endemicity that was assumed on part of the Indian indentured immigrants, so they will recover. And so the ship took on the place of the ark quarantine of Indian indentured immigrants. A certain change happened when this kind of ship emerged, in the sense that here you have the engine room here. So when steamship came into the picture, the transportation became faster, and so you had some kind of dormant cases which got transported to these countries, and there were cases of epidemic. One would be the 1865 Mauritius malaria epidemic, which was completely blamed on the Indian immigrants coming on steamships. Previously it was sailing ships, so the disease generally died down, and also the patient also died down. But when steamship came, this was one of the problems happening. So now you have an elaborate system of how an immigrant ship should look. So there was a certain tonnage ratio, that how many people will be there, and among the people how many women. So that was one of the parts that went in a big way. The other thing is, the centrality of the hospital here. Generally of that time, this will be the place where you have the chart room. So the chart room will be placed here near the saloon, and the difference between the chart room and the saloon will be less, because the captain and the chief officer would so that they can go, they can efficiently go between the chart room and the saloon. But here that is changed. And now let's talk of how the routine that the endangered immigrant had to go through here, in the sense that first of all, in this ship there is a different kind of hierarchy. The captain is obviously he is the head of the navigation thing of the ship, but here there is another center of command. It's the figure of the surgeon superintendent, the ship surgeon. So in an immigrant ship of that time, in the UK Australia line also the ship surgeon was quite important, but here the power of the surgeon superintendent was, it was equal to the captain, in the sense the entire supercargo, here all the people who are being transported, everything of them depended on the surgeon superintendent, in the sense he was also on whom the discipline depended, punishments and rationing, and he was in charge of the stores, and so he could in that way dictate to the captain even things like very navigational things like how much what will be the angle of the sail and stuff, because he also, because there were grey areas where concerns of navigation and concern of immigrant transportation merged, and these were situation of constant conflicts. And then the figure of the sergeant superintendent was also he was one of those who could not get into the Indian medical service, the IMS, because the kind of qualifications that was needed for IMS, the qualification for sergeant superintendent was lesser. And there was attempt in the middle of 19th century, some petitions from some sergeant superintendents that they had to be non-white people should not be employed at par with the sergeant in this profession, but that was cut down in the sense that also non-white people could get in as sergeant superintendent, and that, so there was always a kind of tension regarding the sergeant superintendent and the other figures in this regime. Now, if we talk of disciplining on the ship, there are certain biases which worked in a big way. One was in the emigrant ship, the crew was very different from other crews in south of Suez Canal, or in that way south of Red Sea. Generally in these waters, it was the Laskar, the Indian or South Asian naval sailor, was the sailor who generally manned the ships. But here it was, though this was actually, there had been evidences that it had not been so much strictly implemented or followed, but it was a quite strong prescription that you don't put Laskar crews in, these people who are called Laskars, that you don't have Laskar crews in these ships, because then, for instance, there is this sergeant superintendent who is writing in 1880, it is a moot point whether English or Laskar crews should be employed, and where doctors differ, who shall decide. So I shall merely state that personally I have the strongest objection to Laskar crews, and for the following reasons. 1, that the food is same as that of the coolies. 2, that they speak the same language. 3, that they bring ganja on board, and some coolies will do anything for a little ganja. 4, that they are utterly unreliable in times of danger, as the conduct of what may be termed as a picket crew at the rake of the buoyant. He talks of a certain, so there was always this thing that, so this depended on a certain kind of colonial anthropology, and the Laskar crew was always, because there was always this competition with the English sailor and the Laskar, that the Laskar always brought down the wages, and so there was a huge lobby against the Laskars, and so that was one thing. Now let's yeah, so now let's in case of food, there was, that is one of the things where a lot of this racist prescription worked. One was that generally the people who cooked the food and stuff, they were people employed among, from the people who are being transported, the indentured immigrants itself. And generally, and the doctors, they prescribed that, and they were also people who had been prescribed by the depot surgeon and the officials in the depot, that these people are good behavior and they can also command. But it is also stressed that these should be men of high caste, Brahmins if possible, and if a sheep is to be killed, its throat should be cut by a Mohammedan. And so these things were very much there, that you have a Mohammedan, you have some Brahmins, and the cooking should be done by them, and then you have a different group of cleaners whom you, and there were, that these people, when they reach the plantation colonies, they were given various kinds of tasks depending on the kind of, these testimonies of the sergeant superintendents worked in a big way. And the other thing too, and while rationalizing various kinds of disturbances from the part of the immigrants, one way of putting it, I mean, where food comes in a big way. I mean, this I am quoting one instance of a surgeon superintendent, but this recurs in various other reports also, that I know that many die from nostalgia, pure and simple. So this is one of the reason for, I mean, this is a reason put for how many, it's done? 2 more minutes, okay. So I just rushed. So there's one thing, a lot of these kinds of disturbances, I mean, one of the problems reading disturbances and emergence of some kind of collective solidarity is that all these reports had to be found from the I mean, the people who had done these kinds of disturbances did not generally write, but so it is, I mean, reading against the grain of the archival documents, that one figure that emerged in a big way or in all these reports of disturbances is the figure of the return coolie. So the indentured scheme, there was always this thing that you have a figure of, I mean, the person who re-indentures himself or herself. So this figure was shown in a big way as the success of the scheme, that actually this is not an atrocious regime. You have people who wants to re-indenture themselves, and these people were also, these return coolies were also brought to the villages for recruitment drives and stuff. But this, and also you have these pictures, I mean, for example, F.J. Mowatt, who was the Alipur jail governor, and he was very much part of this scheme, I mean, had this picture drawn that you have frail and feeble Indian immigrants going, and while coming back they are, I mean, that way able-bodied and stuff. So this was the general figure, but here in these ship documents, the return coolie, the return Indian indentured immigrant is also seen as a big troublemaker, because he generally organizes people, and also generally the disturbances start mostly regarding food or certain punishment which are seen as unjust, or the general monotony of certain kind of medicines. For instance, there were certain purgatives that were given, and also so these medicines were also seen as painful to take, and this is, and these are the places where it is found that this person mentions that, I mean, whenever you have some kind of problem happening, look out for the figure of the return coolie. So this person, I mean, this 1880 person, he talks in a big way of the other benefits of having a return coolie, but this is a thing that constantly comes. And then you have, so then there are certain prescriptions of punishment. A lot of governmental work had gone in what kind of punishments are acceptable and what kind of punishments are not acceptable. So there was cutting down of how much caning can be done and stuff, and ultimately caning was abolished by the middle of 1890s. But certain kind of other kinds of punishments, like, I mean, putting chalk on one part of the face, and also if people get into a fight, I mean, tying them together and these kinds of stuff. And there is another part, I mean, I don't have much time, I mean, the role of the, I mean, how women were into this entire thing. I mean, the largest amount of documentation and policy debates that had happened is regarding the quota of women and what kind of women. That was a big thing that came into the thing, that what kind of women should be taken in there, and also to check that whether this woman is quote unquote virtuous, what kind of checks need to be there. And so that is another big thing that comes into this thing. How much time do I have? Done. So anything else? Okay.
Thank you all for being here this morning, and before I begin, I would just like to thank the student organizers and the faculty members who were instrumental in bringing us all together here in Chennai. So thank you very much for all of your efforts. The work I'm presenting here today is very much a work in progress. I'm still in the midst of the research and the writing, etc. So I'm looking forward to your comments and questions and suggestions. Okay, so the citizens in a strange land, the Burma repatriates in Visakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh. On June 1st, 1963, the Indian government began a large-scale scheme to repatriate all Indian nationals residing in Burma who wished to come to India. Between 1963 and 1979, when India stopped receiving influxes from Burma, approximately 300,000 so-called Burma repatriates migrated to India. So why did hundreds of thousands of Burma Indians leave Burma? So I've given a bit of a timeline. Looks like it's off the page. I just want to go through this quickly. There are a lot of things that were going on, but this is just to give you sort of an overview. So about the mid-19th century to 1937, the province of Burma comes under the control of the British, and it's governed as part of the British Indian colony, basically. And so during this time, the development of rice plantations, buildings of cities along the Burmese coastline, establishment of railways, etc., spurred a large transfer of labor from India to Burma. And many of the people I spoke with who are the descendants of migrants to Burma said their family often went to find jobs. So the grandfather, father, usually, and they would often bring their families as well. Then you have, basically, the scholarship that I've read says that there was a lack of integration between Indian populations and sort of ethnic Burmese. And so these tensions manifest in sort of anti-immigrant resentment and anti-immigrant protests during the 1920s and 1930s. And that's not only against Indians, but also against Chinese workers who were in large number in Burma as well at this time. 1929, the Great Depression, and you actually see a reverse. So many Indians stop going outside of India and stay because it becomes economically less beneficial for them to leave India. I'm going to skip a few things and just go to, so in 1937, the Government of Burma Act comes into effect. So the Government of Burma Act of 1935 comes into effect. And now you have Burma and India being governed separately as separate colonies. And so this is a period in which you see changes to immigration, and there are attempts to reform immigration and to come up with a plan that's mutually beneficial to India and to Burma in terms of who can come and for how long, etc. But these attempts to come to an agreement are interrupted by World War II and the Japanese incursion into Burma, which is a period in which you have many, I think the estimates are about 500,000 Indians leaving Burma and going back into India to escape the Japanese. Then, after independence for both Burma and India, 1947, 1948, Burma becomes independent. The Burmese legislature passes a series of restrictions that foreclose a lot of economic opportunities for Indians. So at this time, a lot of Indians leave again. And so by the early 1960s, you have about 800,000 Burmese Indians living in Burma. In 1962, there's a military coup, and the military takes over Burma. And at this time, again, you have efforts to re-indigenize Burma. So Burma for ethnic Burmese. So there are a lot of nationalization of banks, imports, a lot of Indian shopkeepers, etc., lose their holdings in Burma, and so they decide to kind of get out finally. And so then in June 1st, 1963, the government of India, in response to the declining fortunes of Burma Indians, announces this plan to repatriate. And so from 1963 to 1979, as I already said, about 300,000 Indians come to India. So Burma Indians, so people of Indian descent. Okay, so for these Burma repatriates, as they became called, June 1st, 1963 was an important date because it marked two major changes in their political status. The first major change was that for many of the Burma Indians who chose to repatriate, this was the moment when they actually became Indian citizens. So prior to this, they were not Indian citizens because Indian citizenship had not been extended to Indian nationals living outside of India at the time of independence. And the majority of them could not get Burmese citizenship either. So some applied. I think the numbers I've seen, estimates again, about 10,000 of the 800,000 got Burmese citizenship, so a very small number. And so according to the Indian Constitution in 1950, the Constitution had determined that non-resident Indian nationals, so in other words, persons who had been either born in India and then moved outside of India, or persons who were born outside of India to parents or grandparents who were of Indian descent, could become Indian citizens if they registered themselves so long as they were not citizens of other nations. So these Burma Indians were eligible. So many of the people who decided to repatriate, this was also the moment of becoming Indian citizens for them. In addition, all of the Burma Indians who were eligible for repatriation found themselves grouped under the new political category of Burma Repatriate. The Indian Supreme Court defined a repatriate as a person of Indian origin who is residing in countries outside of India and who, on leaving or being forced to leave such country, has returned to India with the intention of permanently residing therein. Those chosen for repatriation were to be provided with correct documentation. And so this is a picture of one of these documents. It's an identity card, so all the repatriates, all the people who were chosen for repatriation were issued an identity card. And this is one of the interiors, and so basically it gives sort of a rundown of their details, and then this would be required. So once they reached India, if they wanted to apply for any kind of loan, et cetera, this is what they have to show. And this lets the officials know that they're a bona fide Burma repatriate. Okay? So they were provided these documents, and they were also offered numerous opportunities, including free or reduced fare passage to India, business loans, agricultural land, educational concessions for their children, loans for construction of houses, allotment of house plots, and employment in offices and industries. As we will see, however, despite the promises of assistance, experiences of rehabilitation in India varied. In the city of Visakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh, where 7,522 Burma repatriate families, so that's families, not individuals, established new homes, politically active members of the Burma repatriate community maintain that only a portion of their number have been granted enough loans, jobs, housing, and educational concessions to successfully settle in the years since their arrival. For them, June 1st, 1963 marks the beginning of a long-term engagement with and reliance upon the Indian government that has been marked by conflict. This paper will focus on this unrehabilitated minority to examine how the dual processes of migration and repatriation have shaped the patterns of resettlement and the political activities of the Burma repatriates in Visakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh from the 1960s to the present day. I hope through this examination to reflect on one example of how lives and even generations can be marked by acts of migration. So arriving by ship, airplane, train, approximately 7,522 families settled in and around Visakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh between 1963 and 1979. Coming to Visakhapatnam, which is commonly known as Vizag, the Burma Indians would have seen a small but busy port that stretched along the beach, surrounded by green mountains, into the Bay of Bengal. And so I've given a couple of maps here. They're all roughly from the same angle. This is Visakhapatnam in 1940, and it's sort of south of the city, and the city is kind of in a triangle, and so it's facing north. And you can, it's a little bit harder to see from this angle, but it's still south of the city. This is in 1963. Around the time the repatriates would have been arriving. And then this is 1982. So you can see how far the city has expanded. It's expanded up to the hills of the mountains that sort of ensconce it. So this period is one of rapid population expansion. You have population jumping from 1961 to 1971, 66.2% increase. And it's also a period of expansion of industries in the region. So you have primarily shipbuilding, oil refining, and fertilizers. And so spurred on by this industrial growth and by the expansion, this is kind of the place into which these repatriates are coming. In the months and years after their arrival, the repatriates began the process of integrating within Visakhapatnam, and with assistance from the Indian government arriving in multiple phases. For many repatriates, settlement was not easy or straightforward, and it was complicated by their lack of familiarity with the area and by the repatriation program's uneven implementation. In the remainder of my presentation, I will examine aspects of the two major prongs of the rehabilitation efforts implemented in Visakhapatnam: housing and business loans. And then finally, I will end with a description of the continued obstacles that face Burma repatriates some 50 years after their arrival. So Burma repatriates in Vizag experienced three broad phases with regards to their housing conditions. The first consisted of makeshift housing in several transit camps located throughout Visakhapatnam. The second phase began after the repatriates had moved out of the camps and was a period during which most repatriates received very little government assistance finding or purchasing housing, and a few received substantial loans to buy and build houses individually. The third phase, which began in the 1980s, saw the government purchasing land and constructing blocks of housing for the repatriates. With these construction of these large-scale housing developments, the repatriate families in need of housing could submit an application and move into one of these so-called Burma colonies. Upon arriving in India, many of the repatriates were initially housed in transit camps erected by the government. The camps were intended to provide temporary shelter for a maximum of 90 days. In Visakhapatnam, the central refugee camp was located at Kantrapalam, which was a tract of land northeast of Visakhapatnam town that contained agricultural land, forest, and a small settlement of palm-thatched houses at the time. There were other auxiliary camps that were smaller and actually received fewer repatriates. According to accounts of those who experienced them, the camps were like a nightmare and provided subhuman living conditions. One witness with whom I spoke, who was 16 years old when he stayed at Kantrapalam camp in 1966, estimated that 4 or 5 deaths from dysentery occurred daily. The barracks in which the families were housed were open structures that allowed the wind and elements to enter freely, along with animals that would venture in from the surrounding tree groves at night. To support the daily needs of the repatriates while they were housed in the camps, local government gave a weekly sum that ranged from 1 to 2 rupees per family member, or sometimes they would give a flat sum of 15 rupees for a family for each week. And this sum was often inadequate for a family with several members. After being housed in the camps, the repatriates were often told that they needed to evacuate to make room for incoming repatriates, right? So they're sort of arriving in shifts. So the ones who are settled in the camps are being told to move out and as new ones come in. According to the former leader of the Burma Andhra repatriates, M. Arjuna Rao, life outside of the camps meant that the Burma Indians were left to our fate. This is a quote. By that time, whatever small resources we could smuggle out of Burma under the watchful eye of the soldiers were exhausted, and we were put to a real test. It was not until the 1980s that the Visakhapatnam district collector began purchasing bigger plots of land for the development of large-scale housing colonies. These purchases were supported by funds made available by the central government for the repatriates' rehabilitation. The present-day Padagantyada Burma colony, for instance, was formed through 3 land purchases in June 1981, December 1982, and March 1985. In this way, the government established 8 colonies throughout what is now considered Greater Visakhapatnam in the areas of Sriharipuram, which has 2 colonies, Padagantyada, Old ITI Junction, Kantrapalam, Yelamanchali, and Tuakaparada, which also has 2. Through the creation of these Burma colonies, thousands of repatriates were helped to settle. The conflicts over the use of the Burma repatriates' land, the manner in which the houses were constructed, and the encroachment of non-repatriates into the Burma colonies continued to be major points of contention. And the next session is on business loans. So while the large-scale housing plans were put in place about 20 years after the first batches of repatriates arrived, an array of loan options were available for the repatriates almost immediately upon their arrival. Business loans and the construction of shops and markets for the repatriates were vital, since many had not been able to take their possessions with them out of Burma. So the process was basically you had your documentation that the government, you would be given in Rangoon. You would take it with you to India, and then you would show that to the collector's office in Visakhapatnam. And then you could, using your documentation, you could apply for a loan. And so usually the loans were approximately, they could range from 50 rupees to 5,000 rupees. Submitting a request for loan money to the joint collector did not always mean success, and a small number of loan applicants were rejected. Initial loans taken to support small business ventures were often not adequate to support a living. Many businesses failed for want of funds, and applicants often requested further loans to improve or expand their businesses, or in the event of abject failure, start anew with a different venture. In one example, a woman named K. Gorama arrived with her husband in Visakhapatnam in 1964. Her parents had died in Burma, and she had no living relatives in India. And while they were in the Kancharapalam camp, her husband left her, taking his identification cards with him. She applied in 1968 for a loan of 50 rupees for employment assistance, which basically meant moving herself from one area to another to start a new job. And she supported herself thereafter by doing coolie until September 1969, when she applied for 1,000 rupees to start a shop near Kancharapalam Metu, a marketplace on the main road of Kancharapalam area. She was only granted 400 rupees, which proved to be insufficient. After 2 months, her shop suffered a loss of 200 rupees, so she closed it and began selling pickles and masala, earning about 70 rupees per month. By 1970, she submitted another loan application for 1,600, basically saying that her first business venture had failed, and she was only granted 500 rupees at that time. Many Burma repatriates attempted to utilize the skills and experiences they had gained in Burma to support their new lives in India. In this way, cooks found work cooking in restaurants, hotels, or churches. Tailors applied for loans for new sewing machines to replace those that had been lost when they came to Burma. And tea and vegetable stall owners requested funds to purchase the wares necessary for starting again. However, despite sort of doing jobs that were similar to those that they had done in Burma, they found life in Visakhapatnam more difficult. According to multiple accounts, rice, which is the regional staple, was nearly twice as expensive in Vizag as it had been in Burma. I spoke with one man named Prakash who told me that his father had been the only one working outside the home while the family lived in Burma, and this income supported their entire family. In Visakhapatnam, however, everyone worked, and the family still had difficulty. A woman named Shubha Lakshmi, with whom I spoke, told me how when she arrived in Visakhapatnam at the age of 12, she attempted to find work as a manual laborer, but she was not physically strong enough to carry heavy containers of sand, so she began working as a seamstress. At the same time, her older brother was laying railroad track. Her father was employed as a cook, and her mother worked at home and watched the 4 younger children. So I'm almost out of time, so I kind of want to skip to the end and talk a little bit about the claims, the continuing claims and concerns of the Burma repatriates. So almost from the earliest days of repatriation, the Burma repatriates organized themselves to communicate their requests and demands to governing bodies at the local, state, and national levels. Since the Burma repatriates were often treated as outsiders by long-term residents of Visakhapatnam, and since many of their concerns and complaints were related to misadministration of the rehabilitation programs at the local level, mobilization among their ranks has often been a central aspect of their settlement in India. They formed the Burma Andhra Repatriates Association, the Burma Andhra Kandisikula Sangam, and they have used that association to communicate between different colonies, between different groups of repatriates who are spread over Visakhapatnam, and to then use that sort of consensus building to write letters to local MLAs to sort of voice their concerns. also to stage dharnas, to do protests, basically, against their situation. I think I'm out of time. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Is the role of mukaddams among seasonal migrants in India. Mukaddam in Gujarati means middleman, or the people who brings the migrants from one place to another. I've tried to use Bremen's idea of mukaddam, but however Bremen was not the first one to talk about mukaddams. But Bremen for the first time has tried to use social anthropological lens and have tried to understand the role of mukaddams among seasonal migrants in India. So taking the whole idea of mukaddam from Jan Bremen, I've tried to understand how does the role of mukaddam operates in the state of West Bengal. So I've tried to locate the role of mukaddams among seasonal migrants in the state of West Bengal by performing a field work which wasn't of a long duration. It was a 2.5 months field work which talks about the role of mukaddams among seasonal migrants, particularly in the brick lanes of 2 districts of West Bengal, South and North 24 Parganas. Both the districts are very close to Kolkata, and it's 1 hour journey by train from Kolkata. Okay, so so for this study, I have largely focused on my field work, but I've also supplemented with secondary resources from different sources. Okay, the introduction of the paper tells 2 important stories. One story is about agrarian distress and its repercussions on village people, both in urban and when they migrate to the city level. So it is important to understand agrarian distress when one is talking about seasonal migration. Agrarian distress has many consequences. I mean, one is seasonal migration and the other is, for example, farmer suicide. So the paper largely deals with seasonal migration as one of the effective strategies to cope agrarian distress, and how migrants, to fulfill their basket of needs, which is not only economic but social, symbolic, cultural, they migrate to urban spaces to fulfill their needs. Farm work in village can hardly provide them 2 meals a day, but the other needs which they expect to fulfill are not being achieved in the urban settings. The whole understanding of village study in social and anthropology was seen as village as self-sufficient unit where people don't migrate, they are little republic with very sufficient resources. But however, in today's time, if one looks at Surinder Jotkar's work or Dipanga Gupta's work on The Vanishing Village, they all talk about people living village and how people are not being able to fulfill their needs in the village and how they're migrating to different to different parts of urban spaces. See, these villagers might be only knowing farm work, but that doesn't mean that they're only performing farm work. So they perform multiple occupations, which makes them footloose. So they kind of oscillate between farm and non-farm work. For 6 months, they are in farm work doing different types of agricultural work, and the rest 6 months, it's not so uniform as 6 at 6, but and the rest part of the year they're performing other kind of multiple jobs in the urban spaces, which can be construction worker, can be as a gardener, can be as a plumber, etc. In fact, the recent 2011 census also supports the same claim, which says that in India, there is more people in urban India than rural in India. And the whole understanding of rural India as a closed unit is changing. Okay, so with better transport facilities and with better information coming to the villages about work outside, it's important that we understand the different actors of seasonal migration. Most of the scholarship only focuses on seasonal migrants as if it's a story of migrant alone. But there are also different actors of seasonal migration which needs to be looked at. Middleman is one of such actors. The other actors include NGOs, trade unions, for example, even state. So I think most of the scholarship haven't looked much on other actors of seasonal migration. They've all tried to focus on migrant alone. But it's important to look at other actors from migrant perspective. How does migrants view the other actors? Like with better facilities, there have been people migrating from different places to another, and there has been a huge migration to what we call as informal sector in urban spaces. Yeah. So as a result of such huge migration to the urban spaces that, which is generally unregulated, unwritten, or unmanaged. So there is a high rise of demographic, socio-economic pressure on the resources of the city, because these migrants think that urban spaces might be a space where they can fulfill their aspirations and their needs. But when they land up in the urban spaces, they see that it's the same chain of agrarian distress, or even worse form of exploitation in the urban spaces. Okay, and this and one such changes in the current seasonal migrant is that it's not only men alone who are migrating. There's a huge single woman, either married, single woman with their children, or married woman with their families, also migrating to to urban spaces. I think it's important to understand that the way we define migrant and the lens through which we see a migrant. So a female migrant will have a different story to tell than, for example, a transgender migrant. So the lens of seeing a migrant has to change when we look from male to female, or from or to other kind of migrants. So with such pressure on informal sector, where there's a large exodus of people coming to fulfill their needs, this informal sector, which promised that it is going to absorb the large informal economy, is not being able to do that. So as a result, it's important to understand the role of recommendations, which plays a very important role. And when I talk about role of recommendations, recommendations come from either from the kins, or from the friends, or from co-villages. And when I'm mentioning about recommendations, it is where I would like to talk about the middlemen. When there is a huge pressure on informal economy, without recommendation, it's difficult to get a job. And it is here the role of middlemen comes in. How does middlemen actually take the advantage of the misery of the migrants, and plays a very important role in the whole understanding of seasonal migration. The term middleman is known as mukaddams in Gujarati, sardars in Bengali, and maestris in Telugu, and in different names in different languages. But it's important to understand the role of middlemen in the role of migration. This is a story where people are moving in the urban spaces in terms of work, and how this middleman actually capitalizes on the needs of this migrant, and and earn their livelihood on the basis of the misery of the migrants. And the second story is about the urban growth. It's also about the real estate investment, which actually supports the whole process. For example, since the study was done in West Bengal, in the districts which was very close to Kolkata, so there has been a lot of real estate investment in the city of Kolkata. If I can read some line. Kolkata, the capital of West Bengal, is one of the 10 largest metropolitan cities in the world, crossing million marks as long as 1921. The erstwhile capital of India, Kolkata, has always attracted people, much after the capital shifted to New Delhi in 1912. Although it lost its capital status, but it attracted migrants not only from rural Bengal, but also from states like Orissa, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, and Uttar Pradesh. According to the 2001 census, Kolkata city itself has 20.4% of the total urban population of the state. So with the mushrooming of different mills like paper mills and jute mills and other variety of industries like dockyard, the city has attracted large number of people. So not only from other states, even Ananya Roy talks about there's a lots of distressed migration happening within the state of West Bengal also. So there's lots of migration coming from other parts of West Bengal to the city of Kolkata, which is considered to be the most developed city in the state. When the former Chief Minister of West Bengal, Buddhadev Bhattacharya, came to power in 2000, he advocated communism with a difference, primarily to attract investments to Kolkata. With such policies, government agencies began to invest on several housing projects, for example, Rajahat Township, and there are many more. Today, the places in the city of Kolkata, such as Rajahat, are booming with new multinational organizations like DLF and many more. And not only multinational companies, not only multinational companies which have found space in the city, but simultaneously there have also been rise in the number of gated communities and residential buildings in the city. The township development is also a response to the increasing demand for better residential facilities, especially from the newly formed elite classes comprised of the NRIs and the IT professionals working in the computer, electronic, and telecom sector. Housing multiplexes and colossal skyscrapers have become catalysts for economic growth and modernization. Such a process of modernization has increased the pressure on the brick lanes, which was my field site, located in the city of Kolkata. As a result of the growing modernization in the city of Kolkata, the nearby districts of South and North 24 Parganas in West Bengal have been the hotspots for brick making and other materials needed for construction industries. To supply the huge demand of labor needed for the brick making industry, migrant workers found themselves in the large numbers in the city. So the question is what I'm trying to argue in this paper. With growing agrarian distress in India, how does one understand the role of middlemen in negotiating with the migrant spaces, with the migrant workers in urban spaces? Do the seasonal migrants enter into a relation of unfreedom and bondage in the workplace to fulfill those needs? What is the process through which a mukaddam, which is middleman, or sardars in Bengali, operates and functions in the urban informal job market? For example, brick lanes. Okay, there have been lots of discussions on seasonal migration, trends, and how the trends have changed over years. But I'm not going into details. The focus is largely on, how do you understand the role of middlemen and how do they negotiate with the migrants? So a brief understanding of my field will be helpful. The study has been conducted primarily in South 24 Parganas, which is mainly dominated by the Chhattisgarhi migrant coming mostly from Jahangir Champa district of Chhattisgarh. Yeah. So, out of the respondents, most of the sample size are from South 24 Parganas, but however, the North 24 Parganas also shows certain changes in the pattern of seasonal migration, which I'll come to later. As I've mentioned that, agriculture and farm activities have failed to provide sufficient income. There has been a huge cry for urban spaces, So there have been a huge cry to go to urban spaces and enjoy freedom. Even what Al Pasha mentioned in his article that brick lanes can be seen as a space for liberation, can be seen as freedom, where they can come out from the village caste operation or from the village practices. Okay, and the same picture is also reflected in the field site, where more than half of the respondents are marginal farmers and who don't think farm work as the only source of work. As a result, they oscillate between farm and non-farm work. Okay, so I'll just quickly jump into the middlemen and the negotiation with the migrants. See, the understanding of middlemen and the laborers is, which I'm talking about now, is very different from the traditional patron-client Jajmani relationship that we have seen. With the changing times, it is not only the upper caste that can be sardars, but even the people from middle and lower caste can also acquire the traits of a sardars. So a sardars, in order to get job for his laborers, they did not only have to come from a high ritual status, but he need to also have better connection with the urban world, someone who can promise the migrants the jobs available in the cities. The changing role of this middleman found expression in Anirudh Krishna's work, in Subrata Mitra's work on Gaoka Netas and Naya Netas. How the whole criteria of being a middleman is changing, and now whoever can promise jobs to the people or who can provide contacts to the migrants about the jobs in the cities get the status of a sardars. The present study attempted to examine the intricate relation between the middlemen and the migrant laborers working in the brick lane. The findings point out that the migrants become victims and mostly end up with large amount of debts because the advances that they have taken from the sardars. So the story is like after the kharif crop, most of the laborers in the villages are out of work. So to survive the lean period, they mostly take money from the sardars, and in order to repay that money, they come to urban spaces and work. So that's an important. I think it's important to understand the politics of money given as advance, and how is the money then taken back from the migrants. These sardars recruit the migrants with no written agreements, and therefore it is difficult to wriggle out of the contract that they enter into. The study findings also indicated that the recruitment of the laborers by the sardars is based on social networks and connections that operate both at the city and the village level. These networks of the sardars, along with the interrelation with other sardars and brick lane employees in the chain, creates a web of dependence for the migrants over their employers, thus putting them in several exploitative modes. The present study corroborates with Jan Breman's account of mukaddams in South Gujarat and tries to understand mukaddam's role which demands a greater connection with the urban job market by developing new connection with the bricklayer employers and reviving the old ones. The Sardars' association with the urban job provides them the needed charisma and contacts to control the migrants and keep them subordinated. These Sardars generally take advantage of the desperate condition of the laborers by providing them cash advances, which ties the laborers not just for a year, but they initially offer, but for next few years and sometimes even life beyond the workplaces. These migrants with less option and no knowledge about the consequences of such transaction often ends up in acute financial crisis, also in physical violence. The subordination or the discrimination that the migrants encounter starts from the recruitment process itself, which is largely based on kin, caste and gender, where they are not given adequate information about the places of destination, the nature and the intensity of the work. So like, if I can recall some of the narratives of my field work, one of the laborers from Chhattisgarh told me that, when they first came to this North 24 Parganas, they thought they are still in the city of Kolkata, because they have no idea where are the Sardars taking them. So it's completely the prerogative of the Sardars and the Sardars' contacts which takes the migrant to different places. And mostly the migrants are kept completely unaware about the places where they're going. The Sardars, who are supposed to play a link between the migrants and the bricklayer employers, are often found absconding from the bricklayers soon after the commencement of the bricklaying season. The absconding of the Sardars makes them vulnerable as they don't have anyone to approach during the times of crisis. One moment of crisis can be at the weekly allowances when the migrant laborers take money from the account to run the family. So in the bricklaying, 5 minutes more? Okay. So in the bricklaying, there is a process of, there is a process of taking weekly allowances, to run the weekly expenditure of the family. But when the Sardars is absent, it's difficult for the migrants to actually negotiate with the employers. And it's important to understand how there's an important social network. So there are two levels of Sardars, one in the villages and one in the cities. The village Sardars gives information to the urban Sardars about the desperate conditions of the families. And on the information received from these Sardars, the Sardars in the towns and cities actually gets hold of the Sardars. So, and then there's a whole discourse on free and free labor. With such less agential power on the migrants, how do we understand the whole discourse of free and free labor? So the whole unfree and free labor has been talked about in the writings of Daniel Thorner, in Jotka, or in Tom Brass. So, which I'm not going into details. So, yeah. So, but again, what the migrants thought urban spaces to be a liberating experiences for them is not actually so liberating. They're equally distressed as they were in their villages. So the whole myth of urban as liberation or a site of freedom is being challenged in these bricklayings. And it's also important to mention that it's not always, there's no doubt that there's exploitation and the Sardars exploit the migrants, but the Sardars are also under constant pressure from the bricklayers. Because since they also have to provide the sufficient amount of laborers on time, so they also resort to unfair means of recruitment, where they recruit people from different caste and region on which they don't have much control on. So there is also a larger politics of power which the Sardars try to exclude, inform. To conclude, the study shows acute asymmetries of power, both in covert and overt forms, that is rampant among the migrants in India. The close nexus between the bricklayer employers and the Sardars demonstrates the hierarchical structure of the bricklayers, which impacts the poor, powerless migrants significantly. It shows the helpless condition of the migrants in the urban informal sector and how they have to negotiate with the power structures networking. The migrants also are often subject to politics of cash advances and never-ending repayments on regular basis. The present study also points out how urban spaces only support the dominant property classes who have the access to negotiate with the larger politics of development, while the poor includes migrants who remain voiceless and are mere tools in the hands of different apparatus of the state. In the present study, it is the Sardars who, with the networking and alliances, reproduce the existing power structure. So there's lots of reproduction of the same power structure which happens. However, it is important to understand the larger web of migrant families, several Sardars, bricklayer employers, and the real estate entrepreneurs in order to analyze the intricate relationship between capital and labor operating in the current context of globalization. The study delineates new forms of unfreedom resulting from spatial inequality which exists in urban spaces, particularly in the places like brick lanes. The present study is a modest attempt to indicate how the migrants who contribute to the making and remaking of cities and how this migrants' contribution to the urban spaces gets subjugated in different forms. Thus, the present study is an attempt to open up dialogue, the migrant worlds, informal sector, middlemen, new urban spaces that obviously requires much deeper research and longitudinal studies. It's over? Okay.
Good morning to all. First of all, I thank Department of Humanities and Social Science for giving me the opportunity to present the paper in the academic conference on migration. As you can see, my paper's topic is the development discourse of Malabar migration and Kasturirangan agitation. Those who are unfamiliar with the two words, that Malabar migration and Kasturirangan agitation, before moving into the presentation, I'll just explain what these two words are indicating. Like Malabar migration refers to the large-scale peasant migration from central Travancore region of Kerala to the Malabar region of Kerala during 1920s to 1970s period. And the Kasturirangan agitation refers to the violent protest happened in the migrant villages against an environmental conservation measure initiated by Government of India. So this is the structure of the presentation of the paper. It's a descriptive study about the development discourse formed as part of the Malabar migration. The migration happened because of the miserable conditions in the central Travancore region, from the region where the migrants have migrated, and to the Malabar, where the cultivable virgin land was available. So they formed a particular discourse of development, which ingrained in the collective consciousness and the collective identity of the Malabar migrants. So in that discourse, the environment has figured in a particular manner, and this discourse, in this discourse, environment is often portrayed as something to be subjugated for the development and process. So development was their migrants' mantra. They wanted to progress, and environment, they developed a human-centric view, if we can call it a socio-anthropocentric view of environment. So that in that way, environment figured in that development discourse. And now the recent agitation, this migrants have migrated to the foothills of Western Ghats. Western Ghats is well renowned for its rich biodiversity. So the Government of India, Ministry of Environment and Forest, initiated some conservation measures. So this against these measures, the migrant community protested and it turned violent. So this recent agitation against environmental conservation measures, I argue, draws its thrust from this development discourse which is formed surrounding Malabar migration. So the methodologies used, like I reviewed the literature and the discourse analysis for bringing out hidden contradictions and conflicts in the meta-narrative on development of migrant community. So we know that Kerala is famous for the massive out-migration and external migration from and its contribution to the socio-economic development of the state, and it has been discussed extensively in the literature on migration. But little is known about the internal peasant resettlement from the erstwhile princely state of Travancore to the Malabar region during 1970s, and the role the migrants have played in the economic transformation of the Malabar region. So the isolated and unorganized individual attempts to reclaim the wasteland and forest in the foothills of Western Ghats turned out to be a massive migratory movement during 1950s, where around 4 lakh peasant migrants came to test their fortunes in Malabar. The heroic intervention by them to convert wasteland and forests into submountainous regions by cultivating food crops and cash crops brought visible changes to the Malabar region and prevented an anticipated famine in Kerala during World War II. So the reasons for the migration is the convergence of several historical, political and economic factors. Massive population growth resulted in the fragmentation of and near exhaust of cultivable land in Travancore, threat of a famine that loomed large at the wake of Second World War, and the discrimination and oppression practiced by Hindu orthodoxy in the Travancore state compelled the people to search for alternative avenues that would secure a decent living. The easy availability of fertile land on lease on incredibly lower price in Malabar was then a natural invitation for those who were adventurous enough to seek their fortunes through resettlement. The tenancy reforms removed insecurity of tenure and rack renting, thereby preventing the evil descents of the Jainis. Further, the formation of unified Kerala in 1956 by merging Travancore and Malabar removed the psychological barrier for population movement. It is important to note here that that migration was a community-specific process. The migrants predominantly belonged to the Syrian Christian community, and the material, institutional and spiritual support and leadership provided by the church and its clergy was crucial in this regard. The church is the central institution through which the development discourse surrounding Malabar migration has been formed and structured, as the clergy claims the credit for the development and well-being of the migrant community. And but everything was not that so fine, as they migrated to a region which is largely unfamiliar for them, and they have to face a lot of tribulations there. And even though the fertile soil was a strong attraction, the landscape and environment remained less amenable to the initial migrants despite of their willingness to fight any tribulation. Malarial fever and wild animals welcomed them in Malabar, while the former was entirely devastating by taking toll of migrants, and the latter destroyed the entire crops. So basically, however, the memory of the migrants and the meta-narrative of the migration says that notwithstanding the initial hurdles, the migrant succeeded in bringing in large swaths of land into productive cultivation and thereby contributing to the economic prosperity of the region. So the Malabar region, which was back then in 1950s was a barren land or forest land, it was now a well integrated and modernized region. So that is the whole story of Malabar migration. So the history formed as part of migration, or if you examine the academic literature produced on migration, we see the academic literature is largely subscribed to the history of migration as history of migrants. Basically, as Abharanama pointed out in the inaugural section, that memory is very selective. So by subscribing to the memory of the migrants, the academic literature also become problematic. And however, to briefly mention about how the memory is structured and organized among Malabar migrants, the memories of Malabar migrants usually narrate the conditions. It's organized in form and structure, and they narrate the conditions that compel the migration, the inhospitable environment to which they have migrated, and the way they have dealt with the harshness of the nature and the eventual success through hard work. These memories are woven into the consciousness of the migrant community, thereby forming their collective identity. Fundamental to this identity creation is the development discourse that set a particular orientation and attitude towards land, labor and wilderness. The undomesticated land has to be tamed for cultivation. The hard work is essential to the legitimization of the reclamation of land, and the wilderness has to be modernized through the progressive intervention by migrant community. Unfortunately, the academic literature hardly endeavors to present a critical reflection on the history of migration, as it largely subscribes to the schema of migrant community. However, there was a recent critical intervention by Dr. Vijay Vagis, and it is a significant step towards such a critical discourse. And I largely based my points on the Dr. Vijay Vagis' intervention. So he departing from the dominant framework of analysis, which places the migration as an unproblematic development enterprise, Vagis tries to capture the multi-dimensionality of the historical experience by addressing both white and grey side of the migration. The study critically engages the development discourse that advocated land colonization with agriculture for progress. The development discourse of migration has to be situated within the modern discourse of progress which legitimized colonization. The colonial technology of expropriation of landscape for agriculture is translated in reclaiming the wasteland for agriculture through mediation by the historical and contextual specificities. This new development discourse of migration, which is an internalized translation of colonialist developmental model, legitimized the occupation, expropriation and homogenization of geospaces such as hills and forests to ensure the development. Clearing of woodlands and cultivation of wastelands became signs of progress. In short, the environment and societal relationship among migrant community is characterized by an anthropocentric vision which is peculiar to the colonial discourse of development. It generated hidden but not insignificant antagonistic binaries such as modernization against wilderness, as well as it projected an incompatible and uncomfortable amity between progress and environment. So, that is the first part of my story that's described about Malabar migration and the development discourse formed surrounding migration. So the second part, I will try to critically interrogate this development discourse by examining the narratives produced or political mobilization tools used in the recent Kasturirangan agitation. So an examination of the political articulation by the migrant community against the implementation of Kasturirangan report, the high-level working committee report that recommended regulations and limits to the developmental activities in Western Ghats region to protect the rich biosphere, reveals the above-mentioned hidden realities which were long unnoticed and unaddressed in the dominant narrative of migration. The statements and articles by the leaders of the agitation evidently show how the environment has figured in the shared memory of migrants. In order to mobilize the community against an environmental conservation measure, the leaders of the agitation had to persistently appeal to the anthropocentric vision of nature, which was already ingrained in the collective consciousness and shared memory of the migrants. Therefore, the analysis of political articulation and mobilizational technique employed during the Kasturirangan agitation offers an excellent opening to critically interrogate the development discourse of the migrant community. A detailed analysis of reports, articles, statements circulated during the agitation have been collected and examined to find out the characteristic specificities and nuances of the development discourse of migrant community, and is concurrency with the explanation offered in the Vijay Vagi's study, which I have explained earlier. The newspaper run by the Syrian Christian Church, Deepika, was primarily used for the data collection as it has good circulation among migrant community, and the paper has extensively dealt with issues surrounding the implementation of Kasturirangan report. To briefly mention about the policies taken by Government of India, especially by Ministry of Environmental and Forest Ministry, to protect the rich biosphere of Western Ghats. The process started way back in 2006, and in 2010 government constituted a committee under the chairmanship of Dr. Madhav Gadgil, and he recommended several measures for the conservation of the Western Ghats. But it raised a lot of concerns and it raised a lot of protests from various states the measures going to conservative measures are very strict and it curtailed the developmental activities. All the states opposed. So later, 2013, the government constituted a high-level working group committee to review and recommend measures for the protection of Western Ghats. So this committee was chaired by Dr. Kasturirangan, and Dr. Kasturirangan report classified 37% of the Western Ghats as ESAs as environmentally sensitive areas. So it includes around 4,000 villages as ESAs. So the areas which classified as ESAs, the mining, quarrying, thermal power plant, and the huge construction project over 2,000 square meters will be banned. And this recommendation and the implementation during around the ordinance came around 2013 November, and when government issued the ordinance to implement the recommendation, it triggered a violent protest in northern Malabar, that were demarcated as ecologically sensitive areas. The places where the violence happened were predominantly migrant villages. So several public offices and vehicles were set ablaze, and several forest and police personnel were attacked by the angry mob in the migrant villages of Kannur and Kozhikode district. So even though the report and its implementation ordinance don't explicitly mention anything harmful to the farming practices and the farming community inhabited there, the concern against the implementation was on the assumption that such restriction on developmental activities suggested in the report would eventually lead to the forced evacuation of migrants in the name of ecological fundamentalism. Responding to the criticism on staunch opposition to the the leaders of the migrant community argued that it's actually the concern and the protest violence happened in, especially in the northern Malabar region. So when the people asked the leaders why the protest is only on Kerala and this northern Malabar region, the leaders of the movement responded that it's a densely populated area, and any attempt to prevent the development in that densely populated area will be met with resistance. That was the explanation offered by the movement leaders. But however, such an explanation would not provide a sufficient answer to the strong political tribulation and violence in Kerala surrounding the implementation of the report. A thorough analysis of the specific background, context and factors that led to the violent agitation would comprehensively answer why the opposition to an environmental conservation measure was intensely opposed and got politicized exclusively in these migrant villages. So the crucial question is to ask why the opposition to an environmental conservation measure was intensely opposed and politicized exclusively in migrant villages. So for that, I tried to examine the narratives and the statements and interviews, speeches of the leaders of the community about the report. The primary task of the leaders of the movement was to express and define the migrant community's relation with the environment in clear terms. So as I have explained before, the development discourse formed around surrounding Malabar migration largely portray an anthropocentric vision of an environment, nature. So this anthropocentric vision is explicit in the narratives and political mobilization and political articulation by the migrant community leaders. Often the discussion and debates of, there is an extract from the editorial in the Deepika. Often the discussions and debates of the biodiversity conservation and environmental sustainability on the Western Ghats spread around 6 states including Kerala moves out from humanist perspective. Thus it becomes an affinity towards nature disregarding the human. Is environmentalism just the sustaining of environment that God has gifted us in its exactness? Isn't it to protect, flourish and make it conducive to the utility of human beings for whom it has been created? And secondly, in this description, as you can see, the legitimization of utilization of environment in providing divine dimension. God has given the land, God has given the environment, and let's make it for flourish. So this was the two features of the narrative produced surrounding Kasturirangan agitation. And secondly, thirdly, and there was an attempt to discredit the diversity surrounding diversity of the environment. And it's another extract, it's a satirical extract. It goes like this: they are turning into victims again, the farmers in the highlands of Kerala. There is no lesson for us. The farmer who loves the earth, who protects the earth, is now one who destroys environment. The people born to protect environment shout that the farmer who spread greenery should be removed from the land. Out of 4,000 varieties of flower species, 48 varieties of plants, 275 varieties of birds, 60 varieties of reptiles in the forest cover of Western Ghats, only one species which comes under the Homo sapiens species become vestigial human being. In the Western Ghats, which is being attempted to be protected by the recommendations of Madras Committee and Kasturirangan Committee, the only being that is not protected is human beings. And also there was an attempt to ridicule the scientific expertise and the scientific explanation offered for environmental conservation. So while the scientific rationality would insist on the protection of the human habitat for the future generation and for the non-human world, science itself become intolerable for a community that has subscribed to the colonialist model of development. It prompts to the leaders to go on to an extent of calling the experts on environment and climate as prophets of doom. So there is another extract to substantiate that point. So in short, political articulation and mobilization techniques employed in the recent agitation closely resemble the development discourse surrounding migration. The uncomfortable relation between man and environment that is formed surrounding Malabar migration through Indianized translation of colonialism acquired more explicit and sharpened formation and articulation during agitation. The anthropocentric belief with a humanist overtone and its legitimization by attributing divine dimensions were the basis with which the migrant community has mobilized against the environmental conservation move. So, in order to wind up, and it is along with the discourse formed surrounding Malabar migration, we have to examine the institutions also. Discourse and institution come together to produce this political outcome. So the central institution, the church, and its working, its organizational forms has to be examined along with the discourse, which I will not go into the detail. So I'll just make a mention about that also. So the conclusion is that the leaders of the movement often says that migrant community always try to protect the environment. The paper refutes the claim of the leaders of the agitation that the migrant community always protected and revered the environment, which never was the case. On the contrary, the agitation shows that the migrants inherited all the essential contradiction and dichotomies of colonialist development model. Thank you so much.